Good morning and welcome to the Solid Rock. I'm Denny Bailey and this is the Solid Rock Online Sunday School class from First Baptist Church in Oxford, Alabama. Thank you for being here. I'm grateful for you joining me today. Welcome to my home. Welcome to our class. I'm particularly grateful for those folks who tune in every week and who are quick to encourage me and send me notes of encouragement and appreciation. Those are so much appreciated, so much welcome and needed. So thank you especially for that. And today I want to look at a lesson entitled Making Others a Priority. You know, in I think it was June, no, it was March of 2020, the World Health Organization designated COVID-19 officially as a pandemic. People were advised to stay at least 6 feet away from other people. If someone caught the virus, they were advised to quarantine themselves 14 days at first. 14 days, 2 weeks. That later was reduced to 5 days. But the aim of all this was to isolate the virus and those affected by it. The unintended consequence was that it isolated people. And that's really the title of our lesson today. The main aim of our lesson is that we got to make others a priority. There's a lot of loneliness in our world. Depending on which source you read, over 50% or up to 60% or more of people in our country, U.S. of A., are labeled lonely. They would consider themselves lonely, and others would consider them lonely. We also can blame maybe social media for this because it's easier just to get online or to text or email a message and not have to interact with the other person. Just tell them what you think or what you wouldn't probably tell them if you were live with them. Most people wouldn't, I guess. But this was not the way Jesus related to others. In this study passage today, we see Jesus teaching a master class in making others a priority in our lives, even with those who are different, even with those who are spiritually sick. Let's watch the master's work here and see what we can learn from him. We're in chapter 7 of Luke. Let's go to Luke 7 and look at this particular lesson. As we start today, let me ask you a question. How have your shopping habits changed since the COVID epidemic of 2020? How has everything changed? We could look at so many different areas, but in shopping, there are not many department stores open anymore. Everything's done online. An online home industry has developed, has born from all of this pandemic and isolation. And so people just now talk online to each other. They talk through social media. And I'm not sure we're better off because of that. But when up to 60% of the people in our country, 6 out of every 10, 3 out of every 5 are lonely, it tells us something. I remember if I'm looking, shopping department stores are now open only a limited time each day. A big department store that used to be open 9 to 9 or 10 to 10 now is open from 11 a.m. maybe to 6 p.m. Very little shopping takes place there. People do it online now. Some churches have never reopened. They've closed altogether. I remember taking some of my granddaughters to see Santa last Christmas, as I have many Christmases before. And you don't sit in Santa's lap anymore. He stands behind you or off to the side, and you kind of tell him what you want, or he may takes a picture of you doing that. So a lot of things have changed. A lot of life is different now in 2026 because of what happened in 2020 and the accompanying factors that raised. But anyway, we're looking today at Jesus making others a priority. We've got to do that in our life. Let's look in the 7th chapter. I love Luke because it takes everything sequentially. Luke, the Gentile, is writing just the event by event in Jesus' life, following it chronologically. So we're looking here at 3 points today in our lesson. The first point is, and we're looking at making others a priority. So the first point is, guess who came to dinner? Second point is, or you can't pay your debt. And the third point is, who loved the most? So 3 questions we want to answer from this passage today. This is a wonderful story. It speaks directly to me. It really points out to where I am in my life and the need I have for forgiveness of Jesus, and to carry that over and forgive others in my life and forgive the things that have happened to both me and to others because of me. So a lot of similarities in this story today, and then similarities in my own life. So let's look first of all in verses 36 through 39 as we make others a priority by guessing who came to dinner. Now, the lesson today starts out as kind of an irony, because Jesus was criticized for hanging out with wine bibbers and tax collectors, and got criticized for that. And when he wouldn't go, they would criticize him because he didn't associate with common people. But Jesus always did the right thing. What a wonderful lesson. And as much as we need to learn the lesson, the way we learn those lessons is to see how Jesus did and try to emulate that in our own life. So go to chapter 7 of Luke and look in verses 36 through 39. It says, "And then one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him," asked Jesus to come eat with the Pharisee. "And he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat." Now, the Pharisees were the religious elite. They were the ones who controlled the temple. They were the ones who made the rules of conduct for the people. They were supposed to interpret the Mosaic law, but they interpreted it and then they kind of rewrote it to the way they thought it ought to be. So they did that. They were hardliners. They were ones who did not bend on the law. Every instance of the law had to be obeyed. They were legalists, we'll find out in today's lesson. So one of the Pharisees invited him to eat, and he showed up and sat down to eat. Now, he didn't really sit down to eat. In formal meals in those days, you reclined at the table. In fact, some of your versions of Scripture, this is an old New King James Version, but others, more modern versions, will say he reclined to eat. And that means they laid down. They had a short table, and they laid down so that their heads were near the table so that they could take an arm and get something to eat, or they could recline and take an arm. Their feet were behind them. So that impacts today's lesson. Now, let's look and see what it says. He sat down to eat, or he reclined at the table. And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping. Now let's take that and break it down a little bit. It was common in those days for the courtyards and the doors to be open in a house. They aided circulation, and it let the poor and the others come in who weren't invited to the meal, to the banquet. And they would come in and stand around the outside edge. And that's what this woman did. She came to stand behind Jesus. And they got to clean up the morsels after the guests had got through eating and they left. Then the others could come in and eat what was left. Doesn't sound very appetizing, but it was a way of being generous, of being hospitable for the Pharisees. So anyway, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil. This is a flask that had been carved, and in it was very fragrant, very expensive oil. And it was a very expensive vase or cup that it was in as well. And she stood at his feet behind him weeping. Now, why was she weeping? What was her reason for weeping? Gave a hint when it said she was a sinner. So she knew something that the Pharisee didn't know. She knew that he could forgive her sins. She knew that she was a horrible sinner. She had no hope of her own. She had no way of saving herself. She knew this, but she knew something more. She knew that somehow Jesus could help her. So she wept. She wept behind him. And as she wept, she began to wash his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with fragrant oil. So she took that expensive flask of perfume or fragrant oil and anointed his feet. She washed his feet and she kissed his feet. And she took her hair and washed the tears from his feet. So she knew something special about this Jesus, and she's just standing behind him weeping and doing this for him. Now it says, the story here is not the common story of a woman who anointed Jesus with oil. That takes place in the other three Gospels, and it takes place in Bethany. This takes place in Galilee, and it's where Matthew, Mark, and John told this story, and it's all about the cost of the ointment. As Luke told this story, he made it all about forgiveness. Forgiveness. What a wonderful aspect of this story. So let's look on a little further now. It says she wiped his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. She kissed his feet, anointed them with fragrant oil. Now, when the Pharisee saw this, the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would know who this and what manner of woman this is touching him, and for she is a sinner. So he made a comment himself, but this is not a prophet, because if he were, he would know who and what manner of person this is touching him, and he wouldn't allow it. You see, the Pharisees would not associate, would not touch a sinner. They thought they were so holy and so legalistic that they wouldn't come in contact with anyone who they thought sinned. Although we know that all men are sinners. We've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, it says, Scripture says. So we see in this first lesson point, that guess who came to dinner? It was Jesus. He came, and he was criticized for associating with undesirables. But here, the Pharisee has some particular thoughts. Why is he accepting, first of all, the invitation of a sinner, of a Pharisee, and then why is he allowing a sinner to touch him? So, questions. Now, here's a question for you. Why might we find it hard to reach out to the up and out rather than to the down and out? When we associate, sometimes we don't try to associate with the up and out like these Pharisees might have been. We'd rather associate with the down and out. Maybe not. Maybe the other way around for you. But for me, that question fits because it's easier to associate with the down and out. I can relate to them better probably. But beyond that, I appreciate those who are coming to Jesus, coming to me so they can come to Jesus. What a great opportunity that is. Now, early in his ministry, Jesus practiced Judaism. I love this lesson. It says that he practiced the rhythms of Judaism. So he would go to the temple. He would interact with the people there. I'm sure he saw the Pharisees, and I'm sure early on in that ministry he realized this was going to be a problem, that the Pharisees were not going to be those he could get along with and endure. So we have to realize that Jesus recognized who these sinners were. Now, 3 points to make from this little part of this story, 3 interactions here. One is that sometimes I'm guilty of this. Maybe are you. Do you find yourself guilty of these 3 points, of these 3 things? One of them is spiritual unawareness. When I go to the hardware store, I don't go to see who's there. I don't go to interact with people. I go to find what I want and get out. I don't like sitting around in there just watching people. If I have to, I'd rather sit down out in the center of the mall and interact with people. But a lot of times I don't even notice who's there. And then so one thing we have is spiritual unawareness. I'm very guilty of that. Another thing we do is try to love only the lovable. It's hard to love those who are unlovable. That takes work. And another thing that we fail to do sometimes is we try to be right, but we do it all for the wrong reasons. We fail to demonstrate the love of Christ when we have the opportunity. We try to judge, or we try to get our point across rather than seek the demonstrate the love of Christ to those around us. So there's a lot there that we need to take into consideration to do. I love what Simon says. This man, talking about Jesus, if he were a prophet, he would know who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And the Pharisee was too good to touch a sinner. They considered themselves the elite. They considered themselves righteous, although they weren't. They were legalists. And in verses 40 through 43, we see that not only we see guess who's coming to dinner, but we see and hear on commercials all the time, can't pay your debts, get the relief you deserve. That's wrong. If I didn't make a debt, I wouldn't have to pay it. It's wrong for me to get relief from that debt when I haven't paid it. But Jesus, in this story, he talks about a debt. Now let's see what verse 40 says in verses 40 through 43. And Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. Now he's about to tell Simon the problem. That's where we know that this Pharisee was called Simon, is his house. But Jesus realizes that not only the woman is a sinner, he did know that, but he also knew that he could perceive Simon's thoughts and knew that he was on the wrong track. So he asked Simon a question. He presents a parable to him. Jesus had such a way of doing that. Not only do we do what's right, we need to do it in a way that's acceptable, a way that's loving. And Jesus, even here, loved the Pharisee and tried to teach him a lesson. And Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And so he said, Teacher, say it. So Jesus says, there was a certain creditor who had 2 debtors. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Now let's break down that story just a little bit. One debtor owed 50 denarii, which was about 2 months' wages. So I would equate that with maybe $1,000 or less, depending on how much you normally made, I guess. And the other person owed 500 denarii, which would be the same as 18 months' wages, or about $35,000. Unpayable by me, maybe by many of you as well. Or you'd hate to pay it for that way, I guess. But it says that he told him this story. He told him that that a creditor owed 500 denarii and the other 50, and he freely forgave them both. He was a generous creditor. It says he didn't ask anything from them. He wasn't asking for any kind of paybacks or time limits. He just freely forgave them. He was generous. Tell me, Jesus said to Simon, which of them will love him more? Ooh, now it's beginning to hit home, and we see Simon hesitate. And Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave most, the one whom he forgave more. The greater the debt's canceled, the greater the love for that one who forgive. So that's logical, and Simon answered correctly there. Jesus said, and he said to him, you have rightly judged. So we see in these verses that Jesus has set a parable before Simon. He could perceive Simon's thoughts. He could tell that Simon not only could judge the woman's sins, the woman who this was, but he could judge Simon's as well. Isn't it wonderful? Aren't we glad that Jesus perceives our thoughts accurately? He knows us as we really are. We can't fool him. We can't say anything that says, oh, Jesus, you're wrong. You didn't perceive me well. No, Jesus knows our very thoughts. I'm so glad of that. So in this second session, we see that you can't pay your debt. We see the Pharisees were legalists. Let's see, when have you seen people minimizing their own sin while highlighting the sins of others? We see the Pharisee did this, but have you seen people in your life? Of course you have. We all have. I knew a pastor who had a temper problem. He would fly off the handle at times. But when he got up and preached to the congregation about forgiveness and not holding a grudge and not losing your temper. He was trying to dip from a bucket stuff that would help us, but he was dipping from a bucket that sounded hollow because he was dipping for something from something he didn't practice. And we've got to practice what we preach, whether we're preachers or whether we're Sunday school teachers or whether we're people who listen in. So we've got to be careful about believing and following what we ask others to do. So we know that Simon's thoughts, Jesus knew those just like he did the woman's thoughts. And he knew what a great story he was telling. And he saw he put Simon on the chopping block, so to speak. He called Simon to answer this. So we see that Jesus again is doing what needed to be done, but he did it in a loving way. He didn't call out Simon and says, "You're a hypocrite." I have to learn that. That's a very hard lesson for me. I fail it all the time. So the third point of this lesson is not only do we see guess who's coming to dinner, not only do we see can't pay your debts, but we see who loved the most. And Jesus asked Simon, who loved him more? Who will love him more? And Simon said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. The more we forgive, the more we love. And not so with Jesus. He forgave all of us equally. He loves us all. All right, so the third point is who loved the most. Let's read verses 44 through 48. Then he turned to the woman. Now he's speaking to Simon, but he pointed to the woman or turned to her or stuck his hand out to her and said, he turned to Simon and said to Simon, he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet. It was common to wash your person's feet. They had either sandals or no shoes. So when they came in, it was common practice to get the dirt off of their feet. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. He said, you gave me no kiss. It was common to embrace guests and to give them a kiss of brotherhood. You gave me no kiss. She has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. Says, you did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. It was common to pour olive oil or some kind of fragrant oil on the head of the guest. Not every time, but in a special occasion like this. So Jesus says, you didn't take care of me the way this woman has. Therefore I say to you, he says, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. So Jesus, again, without being too pointed to Simon, without being too conspicuous and accusing, he said, to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Then he turned and said to the woman, your sins are forgiven. And you see, that's why I think she was weeping. She knew she couldn't save herself. She knew she had to get something, and she recognized something special in Jesus. Maybe that's why the down and out are easier to approach than the up and out, because the down and out, though their view is from down lower, in a sense, they recognize the need of Jesus. They're able to see things that maybe those who are up and out and who have no knowledge of their own sin can do. Then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. So why did she weep? Why was she washing his feet with her tears and wiping them with her hair? Why did she kiss his feet? Why did she anoint his feet with fragrant oil that cost a fortune? She may have had that oil because she was a prostitute. She may have had that oil because she had saved and spent her inheritance to anoint Jesus' feet with it. So we see great things happening here in the life of Jesus, great examples for us to follow. Now let me ask you a question in closing today. I asked my live class this question last week. I said, how do we navigate the tension between accepting people as they are without affirming their sinful choices? Jesus accepted this sinner, this woman, as she was. And yet he didn't get into sinful choices with her. He affirmed who she was, but she did not affirm her sinful lifestyle. Jesus didn't affirm it. So I asked my class that. They didn't have any answers. I didn't have any answers. But then Monday, in my John Piper devotional this week, Monday I got the answer. The answer is a two-part answer: truth and grace. We need to have the grace to accept people where they are. That's grace, to accept and connect with people where they are. But then truth says we find a kind and loving way to let them know that the behavior is not acceptable. That's a very hard thing to do. We need to speak to them in truth with love. Love is the key word, and so often I leave that out. But we need to speak to the people in love after we have connected to them. So I hope this day you've been able to learn some things you can apply. And this week you'll connect to people around you with love. Connect with grace, with truth, and speak with truth to them in the ways that you interact. So connect with grace, but speak in truth with love. I love you guys, by the way, and I appreciate you being here today. I look forward to you coming back next week, and God bless you. Thank you so much for being here.